We're going to get started this evening. It is really my pleasure to introduce Marilee Utter. Marilee is the president of Citiventure Associates, a Denver-based real estate and advisory and investment firm. Specializes in mixed-use projects, particularly expertise in transit-oriented development, failed mall redevelopment, and large-scale master planning and public-private partnerships. We are especially excited because Marilee was also the host of a gathering of the urban planning students in Denver this last weekend, and where we had a chance to visit Denver and see the great city in terms of what's going on with transit-oriented development. We've had the opportunity not only last weekend but also today to spend time with Marilee. She's spoken with some alumni groups and some city leaders in Carmel and Fishers, and tomorrow we'll be part of a delegation speaking at the State House on a committee on joint transit. She is one of the Emmons lecturers coming as part of the college's opportunity to expand and bring in expertise that we might normally not be able to bring in. So we're very excited to have her here, have her part of the college. She's been very gracious in meeting with students and faculty and giving up of her time. So we're thrilled she's here, and without further ado, just a word of note, just to remind you that two images will not be changing at the same time. That's because one is being webcast, so there's a slight delay, not because of profanity or anything we're worried about, but just because of the technology. So Marilee, welcome to Ball State, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to already see so many familiar faces, so thank you for coming again. It's my pleasure to talk to you tonight about what I'm seeing going on around America everywhere I go. And one of the big trends is really Americans wanting to belong to community. There's a huge demand for community out there. People want to know their neighbors. They want to feel safe. They would love their kids to be able to walk to work. They want to go to the grocery store and have somebody know their name. They really want that sense of belonging that seems so hard to get anymore. They also want convenience. Time and efficiency are really important to us. Today, people will, and you can tell this is true because people will pay a premium to go places where they can drive their car, park once, and walk the rest of the time. And if you think about where you went on vacation last time, if you didn't go to the wilderness, you probably went to a village. You probably went, and I use the word village because it is a nice romantic image of what we're trying to create here. You probably went to one of those places where you could just walk around and there were all these interesting things to do, easy to move around. Well, those become the highest priced places in the world. And I come from Colorado. We see it in Aspen and Vail and all the resorts that they create very intentionally to be those kinds of destinations. The problem, of course, is that we kill the golden goose. We go to those communities. We think they're great. We want to go back again. We bid up the price so that we can live there. Pretty soon, normal people, working people, can't live there. They have to drive till they qualify. Then they start commuting into work every day. Then you've killed the golden goose. You've ruined that wonderful village, that walkable place where people can know each other and you can get around. And so what's the answer? What do we do about that? Well, it seems to me that the problem is the villages are too scarce. We bid up the price because there aren't enough of them. So there's a tremendous opportunity if we can create new villages. We used to have them, but after World War II, the land use plans really caused this disconnect. And it's really painful. You know, you can't make a mistake with a building. You're going to live with it for 50 or 100 years. One of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill. We shape our buildings, and thereafter, our buildings shape us. So the work you're engaged in is really, really important. The opportunity from TOD to then create these villages and change that pattern is to create new places that have a sense of district. A building is not a village. We're creating a destination, a place to go. It's compact and walkable. It's easy to get around. Lots of things to do. Very pedestrian and civic uses. And civic means culture, means unique. It means this isn't just another real estate project that could be plopped here or any other 25 communities. There's usually transit, and almost always there's transformation of the community. So what's in a name? We call it transit-oriented development, TOD, transit-oriented districts, to emphasize that district. The Urban Land Institute calls it development around transit, to emphasize the development part of it. Transit village, I use interchangeably. And then increasingly, we're asked about, what do you do with land today when the transit isn't going to come for 10 or 20 years? And that's called transit-ready development. And the quick bottom line is you pretend it's coming tomorrow. You build the same stuff so you can just put the transit in when it's ready. But the value really comes from building the village, and we'll talk more about that. Transit-oriented development, in my experience, what it really is really just an organizing principle to do what we ought to be doing everywhere anyway, which is creating great people places. When you create a transit line and you all of a sudden anoint a piece of land and say, I'm going to put a transit station there, it gets a whole different set of attention than it would have gotten otherwise. Otherwise, it would have been developed the same old sprawl way. But when you say there's a transit station, now people start paying attention, making it walkable, thinking about mix of uses, and this sense of place that's so important. A lot of people think it's hopeless, and surely we've done damage to our country and to our planet, but it isn't. And you've probably seen these transformations before, but I want you to look and see what really makes a difference. So here's one. It could be anywhere. It could be Muncie, it could be Denver, but it's not hopeless. It's amazing what trees can do, especially when you do nice, big, beautiful green trees. But look at the next move. The next move is what really makes the difference. It's the buildings. It's bringing the buildings to the street. It's making them more than one story so you feel a sense of enclosure. All of a sudden, walking across that street doesn't seem so tough. It's a narrower distance. And then here, they finally add the transit, and they put a rail line down the center. That makes the street even narrower, even easier to cross, and it adds an amenity. But the transit wasn't the big move. Let's look at this one. Equally ugly, equally daunting. In this one, they put the transit in first. It's very nice. It's nice to have transit, great to have rail. That did not make a place. You would not pay more money for that real estate. Trees, that's nicer still. It looks better. But here's the big move. Watch it happen. Buildings to the street. And they're not afraid of a little height and a little density. It makes it feel better and more like a village. So it really isn't hopeless. And in fact, that's really what your work is before you. It's what I spend my time doing, is helping make those places into very special places. You know, this is really what we've done before. The transit system, transit and land use are so closely intertwined. And originally, the trolley system, and you had the interurban here throughout this entire region. There were trolleys all over America. I think there wasn't a city of less than 3,000 people. There wasn't a city of more than 3,000 people that didn't have a trolley system in the beginning of the early 1900s. What they said was, at the beginning of the 20th century, people couldn't afford to drive cars, so they had to build a trolley system. Here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. People can't afford to drive cars, so we have to build a trolley system. But these were actually done largely by the developers. They were built privately by developers to bring people out to their real estate developments. And they did quite well for quite a while. But then the engineers took over, and we fell in love with big infrastructure and the freeways. And this was really the era of building the interstate system and all the excitement that went with that. We really turned our back on land use completely. It really was an engineer's world, and bigger it was better and more beautiful. And during that time, actually, transit use dropped, not surprisingly. We were all in love with our cars. The cars had fins and all that. By the 90s, we decided it was time to get back and start thinking about how these work. And we talked about transit-adjacent development. TAD is Todd's evil cousin. This is when there's uses next to transit, but they don't really help the transit. They don't help you ride transit, and transit doesn't serve them. A classic is a big box. We have a big box that's auto-oriented development. You're not going to walk. That isn't a good use next to transit. The other image is Roslyn, Virginia. They have 2 subway lines. It's a fabulous transit place. But they made a lot of mistakes there. They gave incentives to developers to do more density. The bigger the assemblage of ground they could put together, the more FAR, the more density they could build. They wanted to get a lot of development around the transit, good intentions. They forgot one thing, design guidelines and walkability. They ended up with huge blocks, hundreds of feet. The old rule, we try to get 300 to 400 foot blocks at the biggest, 600, 800, 1,000 foot blocks. And now they're paying the price trying to make that more walkable. Transit adjacent, ironically. Today we're looking at places, we're really talking about the place-making business. We know that every place is different. We want it to be unique. And connections for pedestrians, for bicycles, for cars, for every kind of transit is a key point. And so then the question comes, well, TOD, that's a trend. I'm hearing about it everywhere. That's not going to last very long. It really is. And let me just zip through a lot of the demographics that are changing right now that make this going to be very long-lived. First of all, Ozzie and Harriet don't live here anymore, even in Muncie. They don't live here anymore. We're about 75 to 80% of America is singles, single-parent households, mingles, or empty nesters, or marrieds. There's only about a little over 20% of the population is a mom and dad and kids under 18 in the household. Now that means that only about 20% of the population might want a house with grass on all 4 sides. And most of us go through cycles where we want to live one place when we're young and hip and be in the middle of the action. Then we have kids, and then cul-de-sacs are great. Then we want a single-family house. And then maybe we want another housing option after we want to move out of the big house and do something else and once again be closer to amenities and other things. So that trend is not changing. We are aging. And we are also smaller households. Immigration, huge fact in America right now. And a lot of the immigrant communities are very used to transit. They're big transit users. They look at it like a utility. Just like you can turn on the water and should be able to drink water out of the faucet, they expect you should be able to walk out of the house and catch transit and use transit first. And then if you want to use your car, you can, but you don't have to. So when transit is absent, it's a big hole in the way of life. The graying of America, the numbers are astounding, is happening really quickly. I guess the best news is because of immigration, we're not graying quite as quickly as other countries around the world. We're keeping a competitive edge. But the demographics of this group is pretty distinctive. What's really interesting from a real estate development standpoint is for the first time we're seeing a convergence of the demand from the empty nesters and from the baby boomers to the echo boomers, who are almost as big a group in our population, those people in their late 20s. And we're seeing this in product after product. For those of you that came to Denver when you saw the glass house, that was a residential product intended to appeal to the 20-somethings. The kitchens all have stainless, but they don't have high-end stoves because nobody cooks anyway. But they have great community space, pools, party areas. You could get together and network. They thought that was all for the 20-somethings. Well, guess who's buying the units? The empty nesters and the baby boomers. They don't want to cook either. They want to go out to dinner and go to the theater. And they want to see their friends. And some of them are single. So this is creating demand in the market for living places and placemaking that is stronger demand than we've ever seen before. Transportation, I could talk about that all night. What's kind of interesting, it isn't just the rising cost of transportation that's going on. The thing that drives people crazy is the unpredictability of it. They just hate congestion because one day it's 15 minutes to work, the next day it's 30 minutes. The next day you can go in 25 minutes, the next day it's 45. You cannot plan a life if you don't know how long it's going to be. The unpredictability makes us crazy in these schedules we keep. The other thing is, it used to be you could judge somebody's standard of living by their mortgage. And generally mortgages are about 30 to 33% of your income. Not so anymore. Now you have to look at the combination of mortgage plus transportation costs. because it is drive till you qualify thing. You may be able to go out and buy more house for less money, but then you've got to drive and you've got all the costs associated with that. Soon we're also going to have to add the utility costs on top of that because of the way they're rising. Anyway, if you look at this graph, it's a little outdated. The average American household now spends over 20% of their income on transportation, plus the 33% they spend on shelter. For lower income households, it can be as much as 50% on transportation. And in fact, this is hard to read, but these are the cities in America where the cost of transportation is higher than the cost of shelter. Houston, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, St. Louis, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Tampa, Cleveland. Thank goodness you're not on there yet. But the list is growing all the time. Now, part of it's arithmetic. These are places where the housing costs were, kind of low. But the trend is pretty clear that this cannot continue. How about this one? Only 60% of Americans drive cars. You say, oh, that can't be, not here. No, it is here. Think of all the young people. Think of all the old people. Think of the people with disabilities, the people that don't know how to drive, the people, international visitors, people that don't want to drive. 40% of our population needs an alternative, wants an alternative. Not that they don't want to drive, but they want an alternative. Focus on health, wellness, prevention. Do you love this picture? Is this us working out? There's all kinds of health care plans. There's millions and billions of dollars being talked about. What do we do about all of that? There's only one thing that's been shown to work, and it's prevention. Prevention is the only thing that's helping our healthcare system today. Well, prevention comes from a healthier lifestyle. It comes from more walking and from being more active, not from sitting in your car all day. Sustainability and design, what's happening with our planet, global warming, all of those topics you know as well as I do. But what I'm seeing now is a sea change in the demand for responsible buildings and site design. Every office building that's being built in Denver right now is a LEED Gold or Platinum, period. Every other office building thinks they're afraid they'll be functionally obsolete if they are not. Now, the residential, the retail have to catch up to that, but it's happening quickly. Huge impact on that. And then we're all great consumers. This is the Starbucks day. Think of the language we've learned to order just what we want right now, exactly the way we want it. I want a half-calf venti Americano with light room. What on earth is that? That's what I order when I go there. And everybody else, the orders are amazing. We want it just the way we want it. So we're quite impatient. We're not very patient anymore. And then bigger isn't beautiful anymore. For the first time, people are buying more condos than single-family homes. For the first time, people are saying, give me a small jewel box of a space. I don't want to have to maintain and pay for a larger space. As long as it's highly amenitized, I want it. There's a lot of changes that when you take all together are really showing a big change in how we're living our lives. Urban reinvestment, it's certainly happened here in Indianapolis. It's happened all over the country. And this study that came out in 2003 was a watershed study in the real estate industry. PricewaterhouseCoopers teams with the Urban Land Institute every year, and they put out a document that's advice to real estate investors. This is the money guys, and they say, these are the communities where you should invest your money in projects because we think they have a good long-term return. These are the strong markets. They're not looking at projects, they're looking at the markets. And in 2003, they said, these are the cities we think have good future, 24-hour cities, mixed use, and access to transit. And every year since then, transit and transit infrastructure has been on the list because it's so important for a good future. This I thought was pretty interesting. When you look at all the baby boomers and all the immigration and so on, you talk to people, about a third of them said, yeah, next time I look for a place, I wouldn't mind living in a place that's a little bit more compact, maybe a little denser, more walkable, maybe there's a coffee shop on the corner. I'd like that. Yet if you look at the real estate development community and what's being produced, only 2% of the product being produced matches that description. There's a huge gap between what people want and what people are being given. Therefore, when you go into a community and you don't see the nice assortment of townhouses and flats and nice housing options, it may be a crisis of supply, not a crisis of demand. Almost everywhere, the first developer that's willing to step out and do that does okay. In fact, they exceed their expectations. Not necessarily so for the fourth and fifth, but the first and second do okay. As a result, transit has become this new darling of America. Part of it for mobility, part of it for economic development. In fact, the FTA now has over $60 billion in requests around the country. You can look at the map. Indiana isn't on there. It's a glaring problem, I would say. But almost everywhere else in the country is saying we need to add transit to our bag of tricks. In some ways, it's kind of like the old economic development days when everybody wanted to have an aquarium. Then everybody wanted a downtown mall. Then everybody wanted a ball field. Then everybody wanted a convention center. Now everybody wants a light rail system. But this one has legs, and it really makes sense. Important when you start thinking about the transit villages, the places at the portals to the system, around the stations, what they look like. And realize that they're different for every market and for every site. So what they would put in downtown New York and San Francisco was not appropriate to put in Dallas. It wasn't appropriate to put in Arlington, Virginia. It wasn't appropriate in Mountain View, California. It wasn't what they chose in the old transit town of downtown Pittsburgh. It wasn't what they put in Plano, Texas. Yet all of those are successful TODs in their own right and in their own market. Each of those, and there's taxonomies that have been developed, and these are all negotiable. But, you know, different environments call for different kind of densities and different kind of characters. But again, every single one changes. This definition of transit-oriented development is still very much an evolving science. And for a long time we talked about definitions that said within, you know, a quarter-mile ring or a 5-minute walk, it should have all these characteristics. That's all true, but a little bit more sophisticated definition says we're looking for development that improves your choices, that gives you more choices for mobility, for where you shop, for where you live, for how you choose the shelter. We're also looking for a development that has financial return and value recapture, not only making money for the developer, but just as importantly, making money and value for the community where it's located. And this is very much a possibility. We're looking for something that's a balance between the place we're creating, the neighborhood we're creating, and the node on the line. Because remember, once you're on a transit, once you're on a train and you're riding along, it really doesn't matter very much to you whether you get off at this stop or you wait 3 more minutes and get off at the next stop or the one after. Transit's a great equalizer. So now you are one stop out of many on a corridor. You want to make sure that you're not competing with the next stop and that you're complementing those uses. This is just basic, basic business sense. So maybe one station is going to be primarily residential. Maybe another one will be primarily retail, where you would go shopping. Maybe another one's where the cinema is located. Maybe another one's where most of the office is located. Now, they're all going to be mixed use, but the emphasis will be different. So thinking about the role of that station in the region and on the line is just as important as thinking about the place you're creating. And the main thing is it isn't a formula. It really is what works in this location. Lots of people are winning when they're going to this transit and transit-oriented development. First of all, the FTA, $60 billion. Who do they give the money to? Everybody wants it. They don't have $60 billion. So they go to the communities where they have a land use plan that is complementary to the transit plan and says, we're going to maximize that ridership. So it helps you win federal funding. Federal funding today is averaging 50 to 60%, if you're lucky, 66% of the project costs. In the good old days, it was 80% federal, 20% local match. Now local communities are having to come up with a third or a half of the money. That federal money is really a precious commodity. In the state and the region, when you're growing, where are the people going to go? How are we going to address all the issues over time? We know we need a connected node system. A transit system is such a logical organizing tool to help allocate those resources and, again, make decisions for what we should look like in the future. Transit agencies love this. Now, most transit agencies are just bus companies, and buses don't have a real glamorous image for most of us. Unfortunate, but true. But you add trains, and all of a sudden now they've got a sexy new product line. And by the way, people are 3 to 5 times more likely to ride trains, especially when they can walk outdoors. It's an easy walk, and it goes where they want to go. It's not rocket science. So the ridership soars, and that's really the mission of a transit agency, is to get people out of their cars. The big winners, though, are the local communities. The local communities, and a lot of our communities, don't have a there. They don't have a where is the heart of town, especially if they're suburbs, some of those zip code suburbs. So when you can have a developer come in and help build that sense of place, and on top of that, help pay for it so that the public sector doesn't have to do it, huge advantage for that community. Moreover, when it's a more compact development, your infrastructure costs go down. 25% is a conservative number. Ohio's done a lot of research. 40% is the number they came up with. Well, the reason is things just aren't stretched out as far. The water lines don't have to go as far. The roads don't have to go as far. The police don't have to travel as far. It cuts their costs dramatically. And the biggest impact, actually, is in the suburbs, where they thought they were going to just keep sprawling and sprawling. When you offer them a chance to be like a real town, amazing the difference it can make. Other things communities get is a chance to absorb growth, preserve the great neighborhoods that are there, but put the growth that's coming around the transit stations where it can be more compact and dense. And also huge economic benefits. And let me go through a couple of those with you. Every deal is different. Every market is different. But if you look at the trend over and over, it comes down to property values tend to be 15 to 20% higher in a transit village than on a mile away. So let me say, if you were going to build an apartment building in a transit village versus the same apartment building a mile away, you should look for 15 to 20% premium or more. Now, the reason is not because of the transit. The reason is because of the village. People want community, and they want these places. And transit's nice. It's an amenity. It's like a park. It's nice to have there. But it's the village that right now is creating most of the value. Part of the village comes from the density. There's more development, more ways to make money on it. Now, the exception to that is if you have a city that has a comprehensive transit system, you're New York or Chicago, then the transit is such a big amenity that it can add more value. But in general, if there's one thing you were to remember tonight, it's about placemaking. It's about creating great places. That's what creates the value. Economic activity, another thing cities like, is if for every dollar that is the public sector invests in transit, the private sector matches it 3 to 5 times. That's fabulous leverage for your tax dollars. So that means that if they spend $1 million building a trolley system, they can expect $3 to $5 million in private development, not on day one, but in 5 to 10 years, you'll see that kind of stabilization hit. The poster child for this is Arlington County outside of Washington, D.C. How many people have been there? Good. This is, you can see the Washington Monument. This is what it looked like before, very contaminated area, and oil fields and so on. And so Arlington County said, well, we're going to do economic development. We're going to build a transit system. And in their case, it was a subway. It doesn't matter. It could have been light rail or anything. And we're going to put it in the freeway. And Arlington, and they came back and said, no, we don't want it in the freeway. We have a downtown strip, and it's not doing so well. Our old downtown street is just kind of sprawly. We want you to put it under the street, not in the freeway. Now, they only got 5 stops, but they did just that. And this is what it looks like today. The same area. You can see where the stations are because you can see the density in the buildings. And economically, 30% of the revenue in that county comes from 7% of the land. If you're a business, you want to be on that corridor, not just on the corridor, you want to be near the station. If you're moving into that area, you want to be near the action, you want to be near the station. So those station areas have been very successful. The ridership on this line, over 50% of the workers in this area ride transit versus, a national average, actually a county average of 12%. It's been a tremendous success. Also notice the green trees in the picture, because those are the residential neighborhoods. And they were not disturbed when they put in the transit line. They were very nervous. There was a lot of resistance. You can't imagine all the community meetings. It's worked out great. They've really won. Their property values have gone up, and they've kept the wonderful neighborhoods that they were moved there for in the first place. And consumers are winning. What we're seeing is that people want these new walkable neighborhoods. They like the idea of new housing types and the coffee shop on the corner. They just don't want to have to move downtown Indianapolis to get it. They want it in Muncie. They want it in Carmel. They want it where they live, where their friends and their family and their church and their school is. They just want a different product. So when you can bring that kind of product, because you all of a sudden put a transit station somewhere to those suburbs, it's making a world of difference, and people are snapping up the product. We were in Carmel today looking at what's being built there. It's transit-ready development. You could put a train right down that main street. It would be a tremendous success. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail, but there are lots of modes of transit when you get into the business, and there have been proposals here for should we have a commuter rail excuse me, that connects Muncie and Indianapolis. Commuter rails have a certain characteristic in terms of what kind of frequency, what kind of development they support. Generally are really dedicated to getting somewhere fast and in a comfortable way. Light rail is lighter. It's more of a collector, stops about every mile. It gathers people from about a half-mile travel shed. And it also brings development benefits with the mobility. A lot of talk right now about streetcar. It actually runs in the street with the cars, so if the cars stop at a light, it stops at a light. But it's real easy to jump on and off, and there have been tremendous benefits in building retail districts, which is one of the prime things that you see in city renovations. And then it can work with buses as well, if there's a permanent infrastructure and a commitment to it. Bus rapid transit is one of the things all the transit engineers are all lathered up about now. A lot of people say, well, start with a bus, and then when it builds ridership, we'll put a train in there. And that's not a bad strategy in some places, but one of the frustrations is people like trains better than they like buses. And so you're trying to get choice riders, and they somehow will jump on a train easier than they will jump on a bus, even a great-looking bus. Let me quickly go through the experience we had in Denver, because I think there's a lot of parallels to the issues you're looking at here. We started out with a bus system, and for those of you who were in Denver, I think you saw the 16th Street Mall shuttle. It started out just being 16th Street. That was a street I cruised on in high school. Then the planners in the 70s decided we needed a pedestrian mall, and they tore it up. It was devastating. Lots of little businesses went out of business. They couldn't bear the disruption. And about that time, our market crashed. Forbes magazine said about Denver's market, you can't fall off the floor. The only cheaper office space in the world was Kuala Lumpur at the time. It was a disastrous time, but they stayed the course. And on opening day, it was a great success. It cost us $76 million in 1982. We thought that was a fortune and really, wasteful. We thought we'd get about 16,000 people to ride it every day. Today we get over 60,000 people a day. At rush hour, the headways are every 70 seconds. It's free, it's easy to use, and it really makes the downtown work. It's resulted in a lot of development. Now, downtown development is a result of a lot of things, but certainly the transit and the mobility have contributed. So about a dozen years later, the transit agency said, well, we're tired of being a bus agency. We want to get into the rail business. And they didn't want to go get federal funds, so they just kind of did a bubble gum and scotch tape, took it out of the local funds, and built a rail system that went from one end of downtown to the other end of downtown. Kind of nowhere to nowhere. Not a great plan for transit. But they wanted a demonstration system. They wanted to build one that people could ride and see and feel. Well, they did that, and it met its ridership projections, but they were so broke, they didn't pay any attention to the land use or to the stations. So when you got off the light rail, this is what you saw. Not a very inviting thing where you've parked your car there and it's 1 a.m. on a January morning and it's cold and windy, not very desirable. Still in all, it met their projections, and so then they went the route with federal money Here's another picture. It actually still looks like that today. Isn't that awful? Out behind the big box dumpsters. In 2000, we did the next corridor. Picked the cheapest right-of-way they could find, which is a freight rail corridor. Not the best location, but again, they were watching costs. But at least they figured out that you need to have a good pedestrian environment. And here's we saved the old train station. The real star was Inglewood. Now, Inglewood is a first-ring suburb, 30,000 people, below median income, blue-collar, working-class community. They had a problem. They had a failed mall, 55-acre failed regional mall. The city bought it back from the pension fund that owned it, and then they said, what do we do with it? They did an RFP to developers, 12 responses. They all said, do a big box. And the city said, big box isn't our identity. It isn't sustainable. We want something more mixed use. What's this thing called TOD? So I helped them as their development consultant for 2 years, and we came up with the first really legitimate transit-oriented development in the region. And here you see the freight line in the front, and then the light rail. Not ideal, but it's what we had to work with. On the left over here, you see the housing that we brought in. Just a Trammell Crow 4-story product, but for them it was the nicest thing they'd ever seen, and they wanted to upgrade the neighborhood. On the right, you see the corner of the building was the old Broadway Southwest department store. We made it into a city hall, library, museum. And in the center, you see the connections between the buses and the rail and a real focus on transit. Got a new neighborhood out of it, and it has been a tremendous success. So then the transit agency said, well, that's good, except we need more people riding it. Not many people care about going down to those suburbs. So they built a little 1.6-mile line that went through our Platte Valley. This is our downtown, long and narrow. And you can see, so classic. Here's the freeway, the river, here's the river, and then the railroad tracks were all in here. They consolidated the railroad tracks into 3 tracks in the middle, freed up a lot of land. And actually, this is a project I worked on for 7 years. I was a developer on this. And we brought in a park. We did land swaps. We did special districts. And then the area outlined in red is what we flipped to a vertical developer to build out. And that's been a tremendous success, too. The problem they had, and you can see in this image, is there's Union Station in the edge of downtown, and look at all the dirt behind it. So they wanted to build a new community, but they were out in the middle of a bunch of dirt. So the answer was connections. You can see the light rail line running behind that, and that was the rail line they put into the Platte Valley to serve the baseball, football, basketball, Avalanche, and all the performing arts. About 10 million people a year come to downtown Denver for the sports and entertainment. It was a great way to get people to ride transit. So the developers built this. They built a bridge, and they built a beautiful bridge. They made it a landmark to pull you from downtown to their development. They light it at night. It really gives you a sense of place. And people use that bridge and walk over it with stairs. So on one hand, they have downtown. On the other hand, they have this beautiful park. There aren't many locations where you can have a park and downtown and a great neighborhood. So they subsidize the retail, but this residential is some of the highest priced residential in the metro area and has continued to be. It's a great neighborhood. I put this picture in because I love the design. These guys really invested in design, even though it was an aggressive location. And this building is one of the 4 original loft buildings they built. The front door is off the pedestrian bridge. You can get in through parking in the basement, but this is the front door. It really plays to their location and has been very successful. More has been built since then. So then we went to our next corridor. Now we have one light rail corridor. We're going to do a second one. That one had 13 stations, all different characters being developed, including, kind of urban redevelopment stuff. That was going along. And then a funny thing happened. The community said, we like those rail lines. In fact, the first line, where Inglewood is, opened in July of 2000. By September of 2000, 3 months later, it had exceeded the ridership projections for 2015 by 70%. People couldn't get on. If you weren't there at 6:30 in the morning, there wasn't a parking place, there wasn't room on the cars. They had underestimated demand tremendously. So people wanted more rail, and they didn't want to have to wait 7 years at a crack to go through the federal process. So we said, okay, these are more of those. Let's pay for it ourselves and build it out all at once. So we had a bond issue to raise our sales tax from 0.6 to 1%, and for a mere $4.7 billion, which the metro area approved. We're building out all 7 transit corridors in 12 years. So by 2016, Denver will have all 7 corridors built out. We will go from being a 1-corridor small system to a large system, which has all those good characteristics of really being able to take you where you want to go to a large extent. Now, it's had a little overrun. It's had a $1.5 billion overrun, but people have not panicked yet. They want to see this thing happen. We have a Union Station. That's being built out privately, public-private partnership. That'll be about $1.5 billion. That's where all the transit comes. So there's a lot of parallels to what I saw in Indianapolis and what you guys are looking at here. It really can work. Let me quickly talk about the challenges with this development. It all looks good. The pictures are great. When you're around a bunch of developers, you know what they'll say? Can you make money doing that stuff? And a jury's still out for a lot of them. A lot of these projects do not make money. You have to remember the public sector plans the transit, they build the transit, but if you want a village, it's the private sector that has to do it, and they have to be able to make money. Here's basic real estate economics. The project value less the cost is how much money you can make, what your profit is. The value of it is what you can sell it for. This is not complicated. Or it's what you can lease it for divided by a risk factor that we call the cap rate. So in other words, you want to be able to get as much rent as you can for something. Your costs are comprised of hard costs, which are what you pay the construction firm, soft costs, which are design, that's what they're going to pay you, and the financing costs, and then the land costs. So if all 3 of those costs are less than what you can make when you sell it, you're in the money. Okay, so that's basically how development works. Developers see projects in 3 phases: pre-development, development, and stabilization. So let's look at these things. Pre-development is you get an idea and you say, you know, I think we could build some student housing down in the corner over there. And I think that would be a good location for it. And maybe I can get an ice cream shop to go in on the first floor. You get an idea. You have to go start talking to the property owner. Then you have to go start talking to tenants, see if there's any of that's feasible. Pretty soon you're doing market studies, traffic studies. You have to go talk to brokers and attorneys. You have to go get the user to say they want to sign up. More attorneys, more brokers you have to pay. By the way, you don't have any money. You're doing this on your MasterCard, right? This is just an idea. You don't even know if it's going to work yet. Then you go to the city and they say, oh yeah, bring us some plans and draw us some pictures. And did you look at the comprehensive plan and can you redo it a couple times? Now you're paying architects and planners by the hour to go back and do that. Now you're past your MasterCard, you're on your Visa, right? And it's getting expensive for you. Then you have to go do the due diligence and check the soils and check the environmental. More engineers, more money spent. And then finally you get to go to the bank, which you're desperate to do because now you're on your MasterCard, your Visa, and your American Express, and you've got to pay that one back. You go to the bank and they finally say, okay, everything's in line. You got the land, you got the tenant, you got the zoning. Finally, I'll lend you some money. You go, whew, get some money now. That's pre-development. And the more the community drags it out, the more expensive it gets for you. The next is debt financing and development. This is when most people see development happening. Now, this is when you finally hire the architects to really design the project, where you go get site review from the city and they start picking it apart and sending you back time after time and having new comments and new ideas for you. You have to go get the contractor, pay more architects, pay more engineers, but finally something starts coming out of the ground. And finally, someone else is paying for it. It's a bank loan that's paying for it. So you're really thankful for that. Then you have to go market it because you got to lease these units, right? So then you're paying other people, more advertising, PR. You have to buy tables at black tie dinners. And then you have to go lease it. So then you have to go pay more brokers to go lease it, advertise it, run ads, and that sort of thing. But thank God, all of this the bank is paying for. Finally, the thing gets built. But you're not done spending money. You've got to manage this thing. Got to keep it clean. You got to turn it over. More attorneys, more operating costs. And guess what? You finally get somebody to write you a check, Guess who gets paid first? The bank. The bank always gets paid first. So you take that little money, you pay the bank back. You say, I'm done, I got to sell this thing, I just can't afford to hang on. You sell it, you pay more attorneys, more fees, and finally you get money, and finally you get your profit. That's the life of a developer. So that's why they think about money more than they think about anything else. So let's think about what it would take to be a developer on the simplest possible project. You hear there's going to be a light rail station, you're going to go buy a house a block away, paint it white, flip it, and make money on it. The fastest possible time you can do this is single tenant, single use build. The fastest possible time you could do that is 9 months, and it's not unusual for that to take a couple of years to happen. By the time you buy it, fix it up, sell it, close, get your money back, okay? Let's go a little more complicated. Multi-tenant, but still a single purpose. This is an apartment building instead of a single family. Or this is an office building with more than one tenant. A little more complicated, more tenants, more people to bring in. 2 to 3 years since you put out your money at the beginning and you get your money back at the end. It's a long time. Well, now we get into the stuff that people start getting excited about, right? Mixed-use buildings. We're going to have multi-tenant. Now you got to figure out how to lease the residential, lease the retail. If there's an office component, that has to go in there too. But at least it's private. You're in control of everything. 2 to 5 years. Okay? So start thinking about this. If you started out when you were in junior high, you've now graduated from high school. If you started out when you went to college, you now graduated from college before you got your money back. Okay, let's get the better ones. These are public-private deals. This is what it takes to make a lot of these projects work. Multi-tenant, multi-use, public-private financing. Now the public has money, and it's the golden rule. If the public puts up money, they get influence on it. Well, that means more public hearings, more city council people, more planning and zoning boards to listen to. Guess what? 3 to 5 years is a bargain. If you can pull off a public-private deal in 5 years, it's a bargain. Now let's get to the really good ones, where they're actually the public sector is one of your tenants or they're one of your partners in the deal. 7 to 10 years, not unusual at all. And when you go to developer conferences and you listen to these guys that do all the ones that I'm showing you pictures of, they're all saying 10 years. That means if you had a kid in first grade when you started, they graduated from high school by the time you get paid back. Why would anybody in their right mind go into that business? It's a tough business. And why would a developer volunteer to do this stuff? There's only a handful of these guys around the country that want to do it. Now they're getting more interested because the public is saying, I want that product. I want those walkable, great places. And I'll pay a premium for them. But they're really tough to do. And it turns out they're hard to find. What a developer needs is they need land. They need the land buy down. It has to be affordable land, zoning, parking, permits, pre-development money. And luckily, there's by doing the transfer and development, I'm not going to go through this, there's lots of financial ways to extract value out of that product to help pay for it. But it's not easy. It's really complicated. And they're all public-private partnerships. What we know is that these things work best where the congestion is perceived as bad, housing prices are rising, driving costs are high, transit system is a good one, it's safe, it goes where you want to go, and it's a great district, stuff we've been talking about. I'm going to zip through this to lessons learned. First of all, these transit villages don't happen on their own. Transit agencies would love to say, I built the transit line, now the private sector will build the village. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. It has to be, the community has to say, that's what we want to have happen. They have to say, this is the vision we have, now developer, do what we want you to do. Other thing is these things take a long time. We just went through that exercise and you can see why. Guess what? Not everybody agrees on what should be there in the first place. And you're experiencing that right now between the state, the local, different jurisdictions, different players. And that's part of what takes a long time. The transit doesn't make the market. The transit-oriented development is mixed-use development. It needs infrastructure. It needs zoning, and it needs market. You can't make market. And these deals are really hard to design, to finance, to build. They're complicated building systems. Your architecture and planning people, you know that. So, again, they're tougher for developers to find. We talked about a station is both a node and a local place, and it must pencil out for the developer. I won't repeat that. These projects lose money in the short run. Now that's after 7 or 10 years, you're saying to the developer, guess what, you don't get your money for another 5 years. And here's why. When you have to build, you have to see this great image of Clarendon here. See all that public space in the middle? See there's a playground for the kids. There's fountains in the middle there. See the sidewalks and the landscaping and the great lighting and the wonderful pedestrian environment. All that had to be paid for up front to create the place. That's a lot of money up front. And for you to amortize that money over the development, sometimes you have to subsidize the retail to get started. You don't make money until the first rent roll, till 5 years after the first rent roll, and then they pop the rents up. That's a long time to wait. So there aren't many developers that are patient enough. Most developers build their product and sell it to somebody and take their profit, and you can see why. So you got to find guys that are a little different. It's hard to do that. Parking, I could have spent the whole time talking about parking. It's the secret. 2 secrets, the mix of uses and the parking. And parking should be reduced in these projects. You can reduce parking by 20 to 30% or more, depending on the mix of uses you put in. And you're irresponsible if you build a transit village and don't reduce the parking. Density is really key. In most towns, mixed use is illegal. That's going to keep you guys employed because all those codes need to be rewritten. And it's much more important, the design guidelines, than the use guidelines. Form-based zoning is where everything is going. As long as it fits together and it's walkable, I don't care if it's office or condos upstairs, as long as it's a good environment. Quickly design things. Understand the site in the region, not just the neighborhood. Make the connections go a long way, not just to the end of your property line, a mile or 2 miles. How do people come and go and get to your site? Street grids are essential. Great sidewalks are essential. Density really helps pay the bills when you're doing all this placemaking. Understand retail. Retail is very demanding. It can foul up the rest of your design totally. So you really have to become a retail expert when you think about these things. Parking, we talked about. Put retail between the platform and the parking. If you're going to have a park and ride, don't put it right by the platform. Put the platform here so people have to walk by your retail and then go to their parking. And you can stretch that about 400 feet if they can see where they're going. And everybody wins in that kind of case. Invest in the sidewalk instead of the cornices. You probably know this. When people walk, they look down. They don't look like that. So every project, you have to prioritize where you spend your money. Lots of projects have lots of goop up on the top of the buildings, but the value and the character is determined much more by what you see when you're looking down. Keep the block size small. Portland is known for its 200-foot blocks. They're marvelous. Maybe don't let transit planners make you use your ground to turn buses around. You can turn buses around on the street. Don't use your development land for buses. Bring buildings to the street. Use high-quality materials. People are walking. They're going to be looking at everything. They're not zipping by at 50 miles an hour. Open spaces, don't make them too big. Make them all precious jewels and nice surprises. There's lots of research that says the amenity value of a green space to the buildings around it are pretty high. If you put everything in one big green space in the middle, there isn't as much perimeter area. Give us lots of little green spaces, makes a much better neighborhood, adds much more value to the real estate, and you can afford to do better quality parks. Public money, public will, champions, I'm going to let that go. Common mistakes. You don't think about transit and land use early enough. Everybody here is wrapped up in what do we do? Do we get transit? Do we get transit? They're not thinking about the land use soon enough. Not having a clear vision for who you want to be and why you need the transit and how you're going to use it. Not getting a broad conversation. It's just at the high political levels. It's really important to have these conversations with lots of people. You can't have retail on every street. There isn't enough retail to go around. You can have active street fronts, but it doesn't have to always be retail. And the mixed use is lovely when you've got retail on the first floor and something else above it, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be horizontal mixed use. and still be an activated street. Many people don't understand the difference between density and height. They live and die by the density numbers, and they couldn't tell you what density a picture is to save their life. Density is just a calculation. It's a figment of your imagination. There's 20 ways to calculate it, and you should be talking about design, not density. And you can put, how many units can you put in a 4-story building? 80. You can do 80 DUs in 4 stories. I haven't seen anything around here for 80 DUs lately. So people get very confused about that, and you need to be very clear and understand it very well. Don't build too much parking. Spaces are now costing $15 for a very ugly gray concrete structure, $15,000 per space. If you're going to do a nice structure that's wrapped with retail the way we like to see it, $20,000 to $25,000 a space. If you're going to do underground the way we'd all like it in the perfect world, $40,000 to $45,000 a space. You cannot afford to build one extra space. So don't let the minimums that cities set be your guideline. This is something that really you need to become an expert in. Don't expect the developers to figure out what something should be. The community sets the vision, and the community says who they want to be, and they tell the developers the kind of product they want them to build. Get the right developer. Don't hire a retail guy if you want a residential neighborhood. Don't underuse these locations. When the market isn't there today, it will be in the future. And this is a tough problem, but it's really important because you're planners and you're visionaries, and that's your job. And then make sure and invest in the public realm. Streets are so important. So let me leave you with these words to live by with Doug Porter. Choices. What we're trying to do is give you choices in where you live and how you live, in the people you know, and how you get around. The connections, the human connections, the physical connections, the mobility connections, and then collaborations. Because without partnerships, none of this will ever get done. Thank you so much.
Questions?
Oh, yeah.
Are there any questions that we might have?
Right. Right. It's just years of experience. Well, developers aren't bad people. They're good people, and most of them aren't rich. They're just trying to make a buck. I went through all that elaborate discussion of development economics to try to give you a flavor of the risk that a developer is shouldering. So what do you do to mitigate your risk? Well, you do things like you only do things you know how to do, and you do them really well, and you do them over and over again, right? So some developers specialize in apartments or rental residential, and some do for sale residential, and some do big box retail, and some do specialty retail, and some do office. The way they've mitigated that risk is to specialize. They like to do that because everything else is so risky. So many other things can go wrong. So they're trying to mitigate that risk, and when they see the market, and every developer will always tell you, you can't make a market. The market's the market. You've got to feed the market. So they come into a market, and what's the least risk thing they can do? Give you what they're already seeing as selling and doing well, right? And then they're not being cutting edge. That's one less thing they can do to reduce their risk. And the same thing goes with bankers, who, by the way, are the most conservative source of money you can get. You saw how important it is to get the banker on your side. You desperately need that money. So bankers also don't want to take risk. You know, their loan loss reserve is about 0.5 of 1%. They don't want to lose any money. So both of them are predisposed to say, give me more of what I've seen has already worked and give me an appraisal and there's a comparable and I got all this justification to put in the file if this thing should go wrong. So there's huge pressure not to be the first one in a market and say, oh, I know all these demographics are happening. I'm going to go do some high-end flats out in Carmel. You know, you'll hear it over and over and over again from developers. All I have to do is talk to them. And when you ask the guys, I do lots of panels with developers on mixed-use development. And I facilitate them and I'm on them. And I always make sure and ask the question, why do you do mixed use? Same response every time. Oh, I kind of giggle. You know, I say, well, you know, it's interesting. Do you make money at it? Well, you know, it's interesting. If you get public money, they can make money at it at the beginning. Now, once it's established, then it's a more common thing. Developers are trying to make a buck, and they're trying to do the right thing, too, by and large, 99% of them. But it's just asking a lot for them to break the rules and break what they've done before. I mean, that's the higher wisdom I come from. But I just suggest to you, look for the dearth of supply versus the dearth of demand. There are so many examples where the person that did take that risk did quite well, especially if they don't start at scale. We've seen a lot of the losses has been the Santana Rows, the Bethesda Rows, the big lifestyle centers that have way too much goop on them as far as I'm concerned. They could have gotten by with good fundamentals, with a good street, with a good leasing plan, a good mix of uses, but they overinvested thinking they had to make it look like Disneyland or Celebration or something. And they spent too much money up front and they couldn't amortize it. But the good products are now starting to break even, but it's still risky. It's just risky. And the transit doesn't bring value. The reason that the village brings value, it's not rocket science, it's the density. If you can sell the ground for 3 and 4 and 5 stories, you're going to make more money than if you get to sell it for 1 story. So villages, I mean, it's also people want it, and I went through all those reasons, but it's the place and the density of the village is where the value comes. You're welcome. What? No, it isn't.